June 3, 1945, a military transport train crawled through the English countryside toward a processing facility in Yorkshire, carrying cargo that would challenge assumptions about allies, enemies, and the complicated politics of post-war Europe. Inside the guarded carriages sat 31 Soviet women, members of the Red Army's Communications and Logistics Corps, captured by German forces and liberated by British troops advancing through northern Germany. They were exhausted, traumatized, and completely unprepared for what they were about to experience. As the train stopped at the facility and British guards began directing prisoners toward processing areas, the women braced themselves for the fate Stalin's regime had promised awaited all Soviet POWs: suspicion, interrogation, and likely execution as traitors upon repatriation. What happened in the next 40 minutes would become a story told and retold for generations. A moment when unexpected compassion complicated the simple narratives of loyalty and betrayal that both governments preferred. Before we discover what made these women weep over something as simple as female guards and closed doors, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. 28-year-old Lieutenant Katya Petrova stood rigidly as British guards directed her group toward the intake building, her hands clasped behind her back in military posture, despite her ragged uniform and obvious exhaustion. She had served as a signals officer in the Red Army's 3rd Shock Army, coordinating communications during the advance through Eastern Europe until her unit was overrun by a German counteroffensive in early 1945. She had been told by Soviet propaganda that capture meant she had failed in her duty, that Stalin viewed all POWs as traitors, that returning to the Soviet Union would mean imprisonment or death. She had also been told that the British, though technically allies, could not be trusted, that they would exploit Soviet prisoners for intelligence and propaganda purposes. As she approached the intake facility, Katya tried to prepare herself for interrogation, for manipulation, for whatever use the British would make of captured Soviet personnel. What she encountered instead would shatter her understanding of how nations treated captured soldiers and what privacy and dignity could mean in a military context. The intake officer, a British Army major named Helen Thornton, stood at the entrance to the processing facility with an interpreter and several female guards. When the Soviet women approached, Major Thornton addressed them through the Russian-speaking interpreter, an émigré woman named Marina Sokolova. "Ladies," Thornton began, the word itself surprising in its implications of respect. "You are Soviet military personnel who were captured by German forces and liberated by British troops. You will be processed, medically screened, and held here pending arrangements with Soviet authorities for your repatriation." She paused, her expression showing awareness of how fraught this situation was. "While you are here, you will be under the supervision of female guards only. You will have private facilities. You will be treated according to military protocol with respect for your dignity." The words hung in the air, incomprehensible to women who had been taught that capture meant total loss of status and dignity. Katya exchanged glances with 24-year-old Corporal Nina Volkov beside her, seeing her own confusion reflected. Female guards, private facilities, respect for dignity. These were considerations given to people whose welfare mattered, whose privacy had value, whose humanity was recognized despite their complicated political status. But it was what happened during the processing that would become the defining moment of their detention. As the women were directed toward medical screening areas, Katya noticed that the examination rooms had actual doors that closed. Inside each room stood only female medical personnel, British Army nurses and doctors who conducted examinations with professional efficiency and surprising gentleness. There were no male guards present, no observers, no violation of the privacy that Soviet women had learned not to expect in military contexts, where their bodies were often treated as state property rather than their own. When Katya's turn came, the examining doctor, a woman in her 40s named Dr. Margaret Davies, explained each procedure before performing it and asked permission before any physical contact. I need to check for injuries and signs of illness, Dr. Davies said through Vera. May I examine you? The question itself was revolutionary. Being asked permission. Being treated as if her consent mattered even though she was essentially a prisoner, even though her status was politically precarious. Katya nodded, unable to speak, and submitted to an examination that was thorough, professional, and completely devoid of the humiliation she had been prepared to endure. Around her, other Soviet women were having similar experiences. Nina emerged from her examination, looking dazed, whispering to Katya in Russian. They closed the door. No men watching. They treated me like I was a person whose privacy mattered. 35-year-old Senior Sergeant Marina Sokolova, the ranking officer among the prisoners, watched these interactions with visible disbelief. She had been in the Red Army for 7 years, had endured conditions where female soldiers were afforded minimal privacy, where their bodies and their dignity were considered secondary to military necessity. Nothing in her experience had prepared her for enemy captors who respected Soviet women's privacy more carefully than their own Soviet commanders often had. The morning of June the 4th brought the women their first full day in the facility, and with it more opportunities to observe the unexpected respect their temporary captors showed them. The living quarters were a converted barracks building that had been designated exclusively for female prisoners, with British Women's Army Corps personnel assigned as guards. The women were given actual privacy for washing and changing clothes, with curtained areas and locks on bathroom doors. These small considerations, taken for granted by the British staff, were revelations to Soviet women who had learned not to expect such basic dignities. After breakfast, Major Thornton addressed them through Vera, explaining the situation with careful honesty. Your status is complicated. You are Soviet citizens who were captured by Germans and liberated by British forces. We are obligated to repatriate you to Soviet authorities, but we also have a duty to ensure your welfare while you are under British protection. She paused, her expression showing awareness of what repatriation meant for Soviet POWs. We cannot change your ultimate fate, but while you are here, you will be treated with the dignity you deserve as military personnel who survived capture and imprisonment. Katya raised her hand, a gesture she would never have dared make in a Soviet military briefing. Thornton nodded at her. Yes, Lieutenant. Through Vera, Katya asked the question burning in all their minds. Why do you give us female guards and privacy? We are not important prisoners. We are just Soviet soldiers who allowed ourselves to be captured. Stalin calls us traitors. Why treat us with respect we have forfeited? Thornton's expression grew sad but firm. Because how we treat prisoners says more about us than about them. Because female soldiers deserve privacy and dignity regardless of political circumstances. Because recognizing your humanity is not contingent on your government's opinion of you. She looked directly at Katya. And because you didn't allow yourselves to be captured. You were overrun in combat. That's not betrayal. That's the fortune of war. The words struck Katya with unexpected force. The British major was rejecting the Soviet narrative that defined capture as treason, was treating military defeat as circumstance rather than moral failure. The concept that capture didn't erase their worth, that they deserved basic human dignity regardless of Stalin's judgment, challenged the foundation of everything Katya had been taught about loyalty and shame. The breakthrough came on June 10th during an afternoon when several of the women were assigned to work in the facility's administrative offices, helping with filing and translation tasks. Katya found herself working alongside a British Women's Army Corps sergeant named Elizabeth Wright, who treated her as a colleague rather than a prisoner. As they organised documents, Elizabeth made casual conversation through a Russian-speaking clerk who facilitated their interaction. How long were you in German captivity? Elizabeth asked. Katya hesitated, unsure whether answering would be used against her somehow, but Elizabeth's expression showed genuine curiosity rather than interrogation tactics. 4 months, Katya said finally. In a work camp near Dresden. Very bad conditions. Elizabeth nodded sympathetically. I can't imagine. You're very brave to have survived. The casual affirmation of her courage, the acknowledgement that survival itself was an achievement rather than a failure, was so different from Soviet ideology that Katya struggled to process it. As they worked, Elizabeth explained something that would change everything for Katya. We pushed for female guards and privacy protocols specifically for you. Major Thornton insisted. She said Soviet women had been through enough without having to deal with male guards and no privacy. She fought to get Women's Corps personnel assigned here just for your group. Katya stared at Elizabeth, trying to understand. But why? We are enemy. Soviet and British are allies, yes, but not friends. Why care about our privacy? Elizabeth's expression showed both understanding and a touch of sadness. Because you're women first, soldiers second. Because everyone deserves basic dignity, especially women who have been through what you've been through. Because Major Thornton believes that how we treat people when we have power over them defines our character. She paused, then added, and maybe because we know what's waiting for you when you go back to the Soviet Union. Maybe giving you privacy and dignity now is all we can do for you. The acknowledgement that the British knew about Stalin's treatment of returned POWs, that they cared despite being unable to change it, hit Katya with profound emotional force. These supposed not-quite friends were showing more concern for Soviet women's welfare than the Soviet government they had fought for. June 20th, 1945, brought an event that would crystallize the Soviet women's transformation in a way that daily respectful treatment alone could not. Mail arrived from the Soviet Union, the first communication the prisoners had received from home since their capture. 23 of the 31 women received letters from family members. The contents revealed truths about Soviet attitudes toward POWs that propaganda had downplayed, truths that made their precarious situation devastatingly clear. Major Thornton arranged for the letters to be distributed privately, with medical staff and Vera available in case the news proved traumatic. As Katya opened her letter from her sister in Moscow, her hands trembled. The words were careful, written to pass military censors, but their meaning was clear to anyone who understood Soviet euphemism. Their mother was ashamed of Katya's failure. Their father, a party official, had been relieved of responsibilities because of his daughter's betrayal. The family was being relocated from Moscow to a remote provincial city. Katya was told not to write again, that the family no longer recognizes her. Katya lowered the letter, her face completely blank, shock too profound for tears. Around her, other women were experiencing similar devastation as they learned that their families were being punished for their capture, that their names had been erased from family records, that Stalin's regime viewed returned POWs as traitors to be imprisoned or executed. Nina was sobbing quietly. Having learned her husband had divorced her and remarried, claiming his first wife had died in service. Marina sat in stony silence, her letter revealing that her teenage son had been expelled from university because of his mother's treason. A British nurse named Catherine Morrison moved through the room, offering tissues and quiet comfort. She found Katya sitting on her bunk, holding the letter and trying not to scream. Catherine sat beside her, not touching but present, offering the comfort of simple proximity. "Bad news?" she asked gently. Katya nodded, unable to speak. Catherine's expression showed deep sympathy. "I'm so sorry. Whatever it said, I'm sorry you have to carry it." The simple kindness, the acknowledgement of her pain by someone who owed her nothing, broke through Katya's shock. She turned to Catherine and whispered in halting English she had been learning, "My country say I am traitor. Say I should have died instead of be captured. My family is punished because of me. I have no home to return to." Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Then I'm sorry our government is sending you back. I'm sorry we can't protect you from what's coming." "It's not right." The admission that the British knew repatriation meant likely death, that they were bound by diplomatic agreements to send Soviet citizens back despite knowing the consequences, was both honest and heartbreaking. Katya looked at Catherine directly. "Why you give us privacy and female guards if you know we go to death? Why make us feel human if we are already dead?" Catherine struggled with the answer, tears streaming down her face. "Because you deserve to be treated as human for whatever time we have you. Because giving you dignity now is all we can do. Because we're trying to be decent people, even when the larger situation is indecent. I know it doesn't change your fate, but maybe remembering that someone treated you with respect will matter somehow, even at the end." The weeks following the letters from home were marked by a profound despair, tempered only by the unexpected kindness of their British captors. The Soviet women moved through their routines mechanically, their bodies healing while their spirits grappled with the knowledge that they were being held in relative comfort, only to be returned to imprisonment or death. Major Thornton and her staff watched this psychological deterioration with visible distress. Knowing they were bound by orders to repatriate all Soviet citizens, despite understanding what that meant. It was during this dark period that Major Thornton made a decision that would complicate her career, but save lives. On July 5th, she called the Soviet women together for an unusual briefing. "I need to tell you something that could get me court-martialed," she said through Vera, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was about to say. "Official policy is to repatriate all Soviet citizens, but I've been informed that women who claim to be ethnic minorities from Soviet-occupied territories might be processed differently, Polish, Ukrainian, Baltic origins. There might be ways to avoid repatriation if you have legitimate claims to non-Russian nationality." The statement hung in the air, fraught with implications. Thornton was telling them, without quite saying it explicitly, that there might be loopholes, that claiming non-Russian identity might save them. Katya understood immediately that the Major was violating protocols, was giving them information that could potentially save their lives, even though doing so contradicted her orders. "Why you tell us this?" Katya asked quietly. "You could lose position for helping us avoid repatriation." Thornton's expression was resolute. "Because I can't save all of you, but I might save some. Because I've seen what's in those letters from home, and I know what's waiting for you. Because following orders that send people to their deaths when there are legal alternatives is something I can't live with." She looked at each woman. "I'm not telling you to lie. I'm telling you that if you have legitimate claims to non-Soviet nationality, now is the time to make them. Whatever you decide, I'll process your papers according to your statements." The offer was both a lifeline and a moral dilemma. Women who claim non-Russian heritage might avoid repatriation, but would also be abandoning their Soviet identity, admitting they were not Russian, not truly Soviet. For some, this was an impossible choice. For others, it was survival. Over the next week, 14 women made claims to Ukrainian, Belarusian, or Baltic heritage. Major Thornton processed their cases with meticulous attention, finding every possible legal justification to classify them as displaced persons rather than Soviet citizens requiring mandatory repatriation. Katya agonized over the decision. Her father was Russian, her mother Ukrainian. She could legitimately claim either nationality. Claiming Ukrainian heritage might save her life, but would confirm Stalin's accusation that she was disloyal, would mean accepting that she could never return to Russia. In the end, it was Marina who convinced her. "We cannot serve a country that calls our survival treason," the senior sergeant said quietly. "We cannot die for leaders who punish our families for our misfortune. If there is a way to live, we must take it. That is not betrayal. That is choosing ourselves over a system that views us as disposable." August 15th, 1945, brought the day of separation. 17 women, including Marina, who had maintained Soviet-Russian identity either from principle or lack of alternative nationality claims, boarded transports bound for Soviet repatriation camps. They carried letters from Major Thornton attesting to their conduct and circumstances, though everyone knew such letters would be worthless to NKVD interrogators. 14 women, including Katya and Nina, who had successfully claimed non-Soviet nationality, remained at the facility pending processing as displaced persons and eventual resettlement. The farewells were heartbreaking. Women who had survived German captivity together, who had found unexpected dignity in British custody, were being separated by political circumstances beyond their control. Marina embraced Katya, both women crying openly. "Live," Marina whispered. "Live for those of us who cannot. Tell people what happened. Make our survival mean something." As the trucks carrying the repatriation group rolled through the gates, the remaining women stood watching, knowing they were witnessing a form of execution. Major Thornton stood beside them, her face showing the strain of sending women to probable death because diplomatic protocols required it. "I'm sorry I couldn't save them all," she said through Vera, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry the world works this way." Katya looked at Thornton, seeing a woman torn between duty and conscience, who had broken rules to save who she could, but was still bound by orders she found morally repugnant. "You gave us privacy," Katya said quietly. "You gave us dignity. You told us about the loopholes when you could have stayed silent. You saved the ones you could. This is more than anyone else has done." The 14 women scattered eventually, resettling in various countries as displaced persons under new identities. Katya made her way to Canada in 1947, using her Ukrainian heritage and British documentation to start a new life. She became a translator and eventually a professor of Slavic languages, dedicating her career to documenting the stories of people who fell through the cracks of history. She never returned to the Soviet Union, never saw her family again, never stopped feeling guilty about surviving when 17 of her fellow prisoners did not. Nina settled in Australia, working in telecommunications and raising a family who knew only fragments of her past. She never spoke Russian again, said the language carried too much pain, but she taught her daughters about the importance of privacy and dignity, about how small considerations could mean everything to people who had lost everything else. The fate of the 17 repatriated women remains uncertain. Soviet archives from that period are incomplete, but evidence suggests that most returned POWs faced imprisonment, execution, or internal exile to Siberian labor camps. Marina Sokolova's name appears on a list of prisoners sent to the Gulag in 1946, last recorded at a camp near Magadan. Her ultimate fate is unknown. But the story's most remarkable chapter came in June 1995, when a researcher tracking down survivors of Soviet repatriation organised a reunion in London for the 14 women who had avoided repatriation. 9 women were able to attend, travelling from Canada, Australia, Argentina, and other countries where they had built new lives. Major Helen Thornton, long retired and in her 80s, attended as the guest of honour. Vera Sokolova, the interpreter, came as well, having spent her career advocating for displaced persons. They gathered at a conference centre, former prisoners and their former captor who had saved them, united by a shared history that remained politically complicated even 50 years later. Stories were shared in English and Russian. Tears were shed. And yes, there was gratitude mixed with survivor's guilt for those who had not been saved. Thornton attended with her adult children and grandchildren, who learned for the first time the full scope of what their mother had done, the rules she had broken, the career advancement she had sacrificed to give Soviet women information that might save their lives. The reunion featured a ceremonial moment that moved everyone present. The women had collectively created a memorial book documenting the names and stories of the 17 who had been repatriated, ensuring they would not be forgotten. They presented it to Thornton, saying through Vera, "These women did not survive, but they deserve to be remembered. You tried to save them. You saved us. This book honours all 31 women who were in your care." Thornton accepted the book, her hands trembling. "I've lived for 50 years with the guilt of sending those 17 women to their deaths," she said, her voice breaking. "I've wondered if I could have done more, found more loopholes, broken more rules, but I want you to know that I gave you privacy and female guards because you deserved dignity regardless of politics. And I told you about the nationality loopholes because I believed saving some lives was better than saving none, even if it meant violating my orders." She looked at each woman. "I wish I could have saved all of you. I'm sorry the world forced impossible choices. I'm sorry diplomatic agreements mattered more than human lives. I'm sorry that treating you with basic dignity for a few months was all I could give 17 of your sisters before sending them to die." Katya stood, her English now flawless after 5 decades in Canada. "Major Thornton, you gave us something Soviet Union never gave us. You gave us privacy. You gave us dignity. You treated us as women who deserved respect, not as state property to be used and discarded. And when you found a way to save some of us, you took the risk despite the consequences to your career." She raised her glass, and all the survivors stood with her. "To Major Thornton, who showed us that kindness is possible even in impossible situations. To the female guards who protected our privacy when we had lost everything else. To the 17 women who did not survive, who deserved the same chance we got." Nina stepped forward, adding her own tribute. "You asked us why you should give us dignity if we were going to die anyway. The answer is that those months of dignity, of privacy, of being treated as human beings, they gave us the strength to keep living. When we were most broken, you showed us we still mattered. That gift carried us through everything that came after." The room erupted in applause and tears, the sound echoing through a space filled with people who had proven that bureaucratic kindness, that breaking rules to save lives, that treating people with dignity even when political circumstances were indecent, these actions mattered profoundly to those who received them. The Soviet women who expected the worst but found unexpected compassion had learned the most important lesson of all, that choosing humanity over policy, that recognizing people's worth even when their governments deny it, that giving dignity to those who have lost everything else. These are revolutionary acts that can mean the difference between survival and despair. And it all began with female guards and closed doors, with privacy treated as a right rather than a privilege, with one British major who decided that following her conscience mattered more than following protocols designed by people who didn't have to look prisoners in the eye and send them to their deaths.